Story 1. For context, this takes place in the Netherlands, which has a very different working culture and legislation compared to the US. Recently, I received a message from the Human Resources Department informing me that I still had a lot of holiday hours left, many of which would expire by July 1st due to legal regulations. I was aware of this, but in the past, I had always been able to sell these unused hours for extra pay. During the COVID-19 years, I didn't take much time off for obvious reasons, and I get 32 days of holiday per year. In other words, my vacation days had piled up, and my current balance was a whopping 390 hours, not including the 32 new days I'd receive in 2023. That's almost 10 weeks of holiday time. Of these, I needed to use about 200 hours roughly 5 weeks before July 1st. While that was possible, it wasn't ideal for my employer, our client, or me. This is why I assumed it wouldn't be an issue to sell these hours for extra salary, as I had done before. But I was quite wrong. Human Resources told me to contact my manager, who denied my request. I explained how many days I still had open. He said he'd ask the Chief Executive Officer CEO, but the CEO sent me a message emphasizing how much the company cares about work-life balance and mental health. For the record, I fully agree with that stance in principle. Honestly, I think the small number of holidays people get in the US is disappointing. The work culture there, where it's almost frowned upon to take your vacation time, is toxic in my opinion. I'm grateful to work in a country and for an employer where the situation is much better. On the other hand, there has to be some practicality. COVID-19 affected us all, and you can't make up for missed holidays by taking a ton of time off all at once now. I love to travel and socialize, but during the pandemic, we couldn't do much. I didn't see the point of taking holidays just to sit at home more. In fact, my work gave me some much-needed structure during the lockdown. Working from home was also much less stressful than being in the office. So, I explained my situation and reasoning to my manager, but the request was still denied. I was just told that it would be good for me to take some days off and go on holiday. Once again, I'm not opposed to this, but it seemed like the scale of the problem had escaped both my manager and the CEO. I had already planned to travel for 2 weeks to Sicily and Greece, if anyone's interested, maybe also mainland Italy again, but even after that, I'd still have 3 weeks to use before the deadline. I also have a long weekend planned to Iceland, but that only uses a few paid holiday days due to the weekend in the middle. At that point, I decided to comply, but in a way that worked to my advantage. Instead of arguing with the CEO again, I scheduled a meeting with my line manager and the account manager for the client I'm currently working with. I told them that I wanted to take every Friday off until July 1st, so I wouldn't lose my holiday hours. I didn't ask for permission because, while paying out holidays is voluntary, they need a solid reason to deny leave requests, such as key employees being needed for an important project. My situation didn't fall under those conditions, and they couldn't deny both my payout request and my leave request. It would have been extremely hypocritical. As a diligent employee, I wanted to ensure that our client was aware of my reduced capacity and discuss how to bring up this potentially sensitive topic with them. After all, this would mean a sustained reduction in my availability, not just a typical 2-week vacation or a few scattered days off, which is quite common in the Netherlands, even for contractors. Since the client is a key account, and I'm working for them as a senior DevOps cloud engineer, I expected an awkward discussion with my manager and the account manager. I half expected they'd change their minds and offer to pay out my vacation days after all. But they went beyond my expectations. When I entered the meeting, no one mentioned my 2 denied requests to convert my holidays or the fact that I had framed the meeting around the client losing 20% of my capacity. Instead, the account manager simply asked how many days I had left, which we easily found in the system. Then, he proposed paying out all my open holiday days from 2022 and earlier, so 10 weeks instead of the requested 5, clearing the backlog and preventing this situation from happening again. Happy days. I ended up receiving an extra 2.5 months of salary, and I still have all my 32 days from this year. Now, I have more than enough time for holidays and rest and relaxation, and my work-life balance is not at risk at all. Story 2. I don't know what Jebby's real name was, but that was his nickname. I'd known him since kindergarten, and he was always the sweetest person. He was like a kitten, just a genuinely good guy. If you didn't have lunch, he'd give you his. If you were having a rough day, even if you were another guy, he'd give you a hug. Jebby was a true genius, top of all his classes, but a bit slow socially. He liked people, but his kindness made them treat him worse as he got older. We attended several schools together, all the way through high school, which is where I lost track of him. I, on the other hand, was not a great student. Smart, but I didn't care about schoolwork. We went to one of the most troubled, crime-ridden school systems in North Carolina, and I had been suspended a half-dozen times for various things. Nothing violent or destructive, mostly for insubordination or skipping class. I wasn't interested in school. Life was too hard for me to care. Sadly, Jebby became the target of every bully at the school. It got really bad during our sophomore year, especially in algebra class. Our algebra teacher might have once cared, but years of high school teaching had drained her. She cared even less than I did. A kid named Hunter, who couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds soaking wet, took it upon himself to torment Jebby. Hunter was part of the Latino community at our school, which was more of a subculture than a racial divide. He was a loudmouth, mean-spirited thug who made it his mission to make Jebby's life miserable. Hunter would poke him, toss things at him, kick him after class, call him offensive names, steal his books and food, all sorts of nasty behavior. Jebby tried going to the teachers, but they didn't care. Like I said, it was a bad school. Things escalated when Hunter tripped Jebby, causing him to split his head on a desk. Hunter got a week's suspension, claiming it was an accident. Jebby ended up needing 6 stitches and was transferred to another class. When Jebby returned, Hunter's favorite target was gone, so he decided I'd be the new one. By this point, I had nothing to lose. I was failing every class except theater and English. The school administration considered me a troublemaker, and I was on a first-name basis with the school resource officer. On Hunter's first day back, he looked around, spotted me quietly reading in the corner, and started tossing spitballs at me. Childish behavior. But after seeing how little good going to the teachers had done for Jebby, I knew I had to handle this differently. I got up from my desk, circled the room, and squared up to Hunter. He stood up, but I outweighed him by a good 40 pounds, so I knew how this would go. I grabbed him in a half Nelson, held it for about 5 seconds, then stepped back. Hunter tried throwing a few punches, but they were weak, just taps on my chin and cheeks, like being hit by a fly in sneakers. The teacher was shouting by this point, but I let him hit me 5 or 6 more times before shoving him away. He stumbled over a few desks, and I walked out the door. About 10 minutes later, the school resource officer showed up, and I told him that Hunter had attacked me. I said I was just going to sharpen my pencil when Hunter stepped up and pushed me. No one, and I mean no one, asked the other students what had happened, and the teacher hadn't seen the start of it. Of course, Hunter denied it, but in his frustration, he pushed the resource officer, who was telling him to sit down. That was the final straw. Hunter ended up in handcuffs. When they searched him, they found 3 rolls of an illegal substance, a pocket knife, and a pack of cigarettes. Hunter was expelled immediately and charged with assaulting a police officer, possession of illegal substances on school property, and carrying a concealed weapon, a Class 1 misdemeanor in North Carolina. Since it was his 3rd strike for substance-related offenses, the charges escalated to a felony. I got a 2-day suspension, adding to my already long list of infractions, but honestly, it was worth it. Jebby, wherever you are, I hope you're doing well. You deserve so much better. Update. Alright, as promised, I did some searching to find Jebby. My mom still had my old yearbook from freshman year, and I remembered that Jebby was really into theater. I found his name and picture in the credits for the school play that year. After some quick searching online, I discovered that Jebby got married. The announcement was still up on the web and moved to California. He now owns a small computer repair shop and has a child. Even more amazing, he designs those robotic battle machines you see in competitions. It's some of the coolest stuff I've ever seen. I'm not sure if I have the courage to call him. No way he'd remember me. But I'm just glad to know he's doing all right. Story 3. Greetings. I shared this story once before, but deleted it due to concerns about legal reasons. After revising it, I feel more comfortable sharing now. The title was something along the lines of Cream-Filled Karma Ending for Boss. I love this subreddit, along with malicious compliance and petty revenge. I can tell you, as a longtime lurker, this story is worth the read for some well-deserved payback. I worked for a small IT consulting firm for 7 years, owned and run by someone we'll call Dick. The first 2 years were fine. Occasionally, he would take things too far. He was passionate about his opinions and always had to be right, so I let him have it. I didn't have to agree, but I could see his need to be right and left it at that. However, I started to notice a pattern. The turnover rate at the company was about 2 years, and soon I realized why. Dick would pick one worker and make it his personal mission to make that person as miserable as possible. I assume it was an ego thing. For months, I would hear him constantly yelling at this one guy. After their meetings, my coworker would walk back to his office, which I could see from my desk, and I could just tell how stressed and miserable he was. One day, I asked him, "What's going on? Why is he always giving you such a hard time?" He didn't really know. He confided in me about the level of hell he was enduring and some of the things Dick had said and done. I couldn't believe it. I thought he was exaggerating because some of it just seemed too far-fetched. Little did I know that he was telling the truth. A few months later, that coworker finally found another job and left. I still talk to him a couple of times a year, and he always says it was the best decision he ever made. Then, Dick set his sights on me. I can tolerate a lot, so for the next 5 years, I dealt with it. He would insult me almost every day, each time with more creative language. But I didn't care. I never took it home with me, so it wasn't a big problem for me. For Dick, though, it became a challenge. At one point, unrelated to his behavior, I gave notice that I was leaving. He had asked me to get a couple of certifications, promising to take care of me if I did. Once I obtained the certifications, he backed out of the agreement and acted like he didn't remember. A few months later, when I handed in my notice, he immediately called me, begging me to stay. He matched the offer I received and even increased my salary by another $15,000. Not wanting to start a new job, I decided to stay. That decision turned out to be a mistake. I learned that money isn't everything. It's far more important to go where you're happy. That's the best life advice I can give from this experience. For a couple of months, things were fine. Dick left me alone and wasn't in the office much. Then one day, he decided to start up again, only this time, he ran out of material. My work was solid, and he had no grounds to criticize me. His only remaining tactic was sarcasm and ego-driven jabs, but those didn't affect me either. Here's a typical day. He'd complain about something, let's say his phone, and after he was done, I'd offer a suggestion. His response, with an entitled and sarcastic tone, he'd ask if I was an expert on the subject and demand to see my credentials. I quickly learned not to speak unless spoken to, and whenever he made a snide comment, I'd simply respond with, "Okay." Since his usual methods weren't working, he started making things up. Our small company would go out to eat or order in on Fridays. One day, I ate half my sandwich and wrapped the rest to take home. He saw this and claimed I was taking home dinner on his dime. Every time there was leftover food, even just a single French fry, he'd inspect it and find some reason to yell. So, I started bringing my own lunch on Fridays. I'd order a drink and a side, finish both, and eat my packed lunch. If I didn't finish, there was nothing for him to complain about. You could see the disappointment on his face when he couldn't find anything wrong with my plate. This went on for a few weeks, and when he realized he had no grounds to complain, He moved on to his next target, the bathroom. This was something I actually researched because I wondered if there was anything I could do legally. Anytime someone used the bathroom, he would blame me for the smell. Instead of saying hello when passing me, he'd ask, "Did you use spray?" or "Did you light a match?" It was hateful, but that was just how he was. I honestly think he had some kind of fixation with it, which is why I looked into it legally. He seemed far too invested in this subject, so I'll leave the rest unsaid. I must have shown some disapproval because he never stopped. However, I found a way to get him to stop asking about the air freshener. Every time I used the bathroom, even if just for a quick break, I'd use an entire can of air freshener. It wasn't easy. I had to cover my face to avoid inhaling it all. It took a surprising amount of time to empty a whole can, but after I was done, there was no denying that someone had used the spray. Dick had to keep buying new cans. After about 5 weeks, he must have figured it out because he stuck to asking about matches after that. He even started providing them in the bathroom. One day, we were out with a client. The topic at the table was, "What's your favorite meal?" I answered. "Hot wings, I could eat them every day," Dick chimed in with. Just imagine how bad the bathroom would smell. Most people at the table wouldn't get the context, but I knew what he meant. He said this in front of a client, in public, while we were eating. I nearly walked out, but then I remembered that he had driven, and it was a long way back. Plus, Dick was over 60. What kind of person knocks out a senior citizen? I kept repeating that to myself to maintain control. I rarely get angry, but this was the last straw. I spent the entire day convincing myself not to react because I knew I'd go to jail, and he would win. During this time, Dick also started messing with my money. He was 4 to 5 months behind on reimbursements, and paychecks were often a week late. If you asked him where the money was, he'd say, "Next week." When you reminded him he'd said the same thing the previous week, he'd play dumb. I somehow made it through the day without reacting, but I wasn't going to let it go unanswered. That incident was too close to crossing the line. If Dick wanted trouble, I was going to give it to him, but in a lawful way. That night, the idea came to me, and after doing some research, I realized it could work. My plan was to mirror his behavior until he fired me. Once fired, he would have to pay me half of my $65,000 salary, $2,500, until I found a new job. I could live just fine on $2,500. Why not make him pay for everything he had said and done over the years? In my state, to qualify for unemployment, you can't be fired for misconduct. If I had blown up at him, I wouldn't qualify. But if I was laid off, I would. So, I just needed to make him fire me without giving him a valid reason. First, I targeted his favorite thing, meetings. Dick loved to hear himself talk and walk us through his thought process step by step, congratulating himself as he went. I started speaking up in meetings, suggesting more efficient and cost-effective ways of doing things. Others liked my ideas, which made him furious. His face would turn red, but he couldn't dismiss them without looking foolish. Then, I started making comments within earshot of him, like, "Make sure you do it Dick's way. It takes longer, but it's better than him losing his temper." Everyone would laugh, but it wasn't a direct insult. Dick had a massive ego, and I knew this would irritate him. It did. His retaliation came swiftly. He started accusing me of things with no basis and played coy when asked to provide details. He even put words in my mouth, but I refused to give him the reaction he wanted. I simply went along with whatever he said, which only made him angrier. 6 months went by, and I was still working there. We were only getting a couple of calls a day, each lasting about 15 minutes. This was due to Dick's poor business decisions. While I took some satisfaction in knowing he was losing money, I still hadn't been laid off. I needed to make him want to fire me. So, I turned up the heat. I was asked to travel to a client by the second in command. I said, "I'm sorry, but I haven't been reimbursed for travel expenses in 6 months, and my work cell phone service has been cut off. With the way business is going, I'd be foolish to take on more expenses. I'm already owed over $2,000. Once that's paid in full, I'll continue on a week-to-week basis, with reimbursements paid in full. That same day, Dick set up a payment plan to pay back the money he owed me over 3 weeks. I told him, "Understood. After 3 weeks, I'll be back on the road." I made sure he understood that I wouldn't travel until the reimbursement was paid in full. For 3 weeks, he paid me my full salary while I did nothing but wait. He also instructed the second-in-command to drive me anywhere I was needed, so I essentially had my own personal taxi service for the few calls we had. The second-in-command was in on it and loved every second of it. On the 3rd week, with 3 days left until the final payment, it happened. Dick came into my office, gave me his usual dismissive wave to follow him, and we sat down. He asked me what the problem was. I told him, "The problem is, you need a new hobby. On one hand, you've got someone who's worked hard for you for 7 years. On the other, you have this need to bash someone's ego into the ground. I'm not going to conform and provide both." He asked for examples, and I told him he knew exactly what I was talking about. He played coy, as expected, and I laughed. After a pause, he asked, "If you felt this way, why didn't you talk to me about it?" I reminded him that I had twice, and both times he had humiliated me in front of others and said, "This is it." What my career in it had to do with his ego, I'll never know. He responded by saying I was behind the times and my work had been poor. He claimed that out of the kindness of his heart, he had given me a raise after I demanded it. I just responded with, "Okay." Finally, he said the words I'd been waiting for, "I want to call it quits." I remained professional, apologized that things didn't work out, and spent the next 2 hours going over things with coworkers to ensure a smooth transition. I shook his hand with a smile and left without saying anything negative. I knew the fruit of my labor would soon speak for itself. On the way home, I called my family to share the good news. Everyone was thrilled for me. When I got home, I updated the dates on the unemployment forms I had already filled out and submitted them. I called the state to confirm everything was in order on my end. Now, it was a waiting game. My plan came to fruition when Dick received the letter in the mail, informing him that he had to pay half my salary for the next 6 months, or until I found a new job. In a panic, Dick claimed that I was fired for poor performance. The state responded by asking him to prove it. In my state, the employer bears the burden of proof. My record was spotless, and Dick couldn't rely on a client to back him up because they all liked me and appreciated my work. Desperate, Dick called his lawyer, who told him he was in trouble. Later, Dick tried to save face by telling coworkers that he felt bad for me and decided to allow unemployment to save his ego. That made it clear that my plan had worked. He realized I had outsmarted him and gotten the better of him. In a last-ditch effort, he lied about how much I made. The state asked me to provide proof, so I sent them copies of my checks and pay stubs from the past 6 months. After that, it was smooth sailing. The state representative even told me that Dick had been flagged for lying, making the remaining steps easy. When asked why I was terminated, I said, "Dick made some poor business decisions that resulted in the company losing clients. He let me go as a business decision, and in his shoes, I would have done the same." I wrote it that way on purpose, knowing exactly how Dick would react. The state saw me as a down-to-earth, honest person, and then they saw Dick's predictable response: angry, dishonest, and unprofessional. I knew that would seal the deal even before the facts were considered. In the end, Dick had no choice but to pay me every single week. His money went to the state first, which then sent it to me, so he couldn't play any games with my pay. For the next 6 months, I enjoyed myself, pursued my hobbies, and lived life to the fullest, all on Dick's dime. When the letter came to renew unemployment, I declined because taxpayers would have to cover the cost after 6 months, and I didn't want to do that. 3 weeks later, I had a new job. It was either that or knock him out at that lunch. It wasn't easy, but I'm proud of how I handled it. I feel vindicated. The world isn't often balanced, and evil usually wins. But not this time. This time, it cost Dick $2,500. All in all, Tenton I'd do it again. Due to his age, I doubt this experience humbled him. But it taught me something important. Money isn't everything. The most valuable thing is your happiness. A year later, I'm very happy in my new job with a new boss. I've rediscovered who I am, the goofy, friendly guy whose light is no longer dimmed by a dark presence. Now, I can be myself without fear of punishment. Story 4. I hope this nerdy revenge is petty enough for this place. I'm writing this on my phone, and English is not my first language, so I hope it'll be understandable. I was the kind of student who got good grades with little effort, at least in subjects like mathematics and physics. I'm a logical thinker, but I'm terrible at remembering facts and, admittedly, a bit lazy. Everything was going well until I had him as my teacher. Let's call him Gargamel. My dad said he looked like the character from the Smurfs, and honestly, he kind of did. Gargamel was the stereotypical, evil physics teacher. If you imagine one in your head, it's probably close to what he was like. He was known for making his students miserable, and since he was friends with the principal, complaints about him never went anywhere. Even a fellow teacher, who had a bit of a sadistic sense of humor, laughed when he heard we had Gargamel for physics. This teacher only liked students who were smart, hard-working, and who calculated problems exactly the way he did, with all the extra unnecessary steps. If you didn't meet all these criteria, he made it his mission to humiliate you in front of the class. Whenever a student didn't understand a problem, he'd make them solve it in front of everyone, using a projector, and barely offer any help. He'd leave them to struggle for half an hour or more, all while making passive-aggressive comments. Even students who always tried their best weren't safe from his ridicule. There was one girl in our class who spoke English quite well, but Gargamel pretended not to understand her and demanded that one of us translate for him, even though it was completely unnecessary. Needless to say, Gargamel wasn't too happy to have me as a student. Whenever he explained how to solve a problem, I'd quickly understand it, write it down, and move on to the next one. I didn't see the point in wasting time when I could get ahead on homework. He noticed I wasn't watching him attentively and tried to catch me off guard by asking me to continue a problem in front of the class. But since I already understood the exercise, I easily kept up. He checked on me several times throughout the year, always with that smug grin he had when he expected someone to struggle, but he never managed to catch me off guard. Since he couldn't trip me up during class, he started nitpicking and trying to make me uncomfortable in other ways, often unrelated to physics. He loved checking homework and having students present their solutions. One day, he walked over to me, looked at the calculations I had done on the sheet he handed out, and made fun of me for how I had written it down. He complained that my work was poorly done and non-representable, even though I had solved the problem correctly. The way I saw it, there was enough space on the paper, and I calculated it my way. But in his mind, only his method was acceptable, and he despised anyone who did it differently. He was notorious for stealing points here and there if you didn't follow his exact process. We had several exams throughout the year, and during one of them, there was a question that should have taken up almost the entire page if solved using his lengthy method. However, I found a way to simplify the problem into something far more straightforward. My solution only took up a quarter of the page, and it wasn't remotely close to the method he wanted us to use. Since I still had plenty of time, I decided to write a few sentences explaining why my solution was correct, mostly to avoid losing points. When he handed back the exams, I saw that he had given me full points for that question. I often made small mistakes, but not on this one. After that, Gargamel seemed to give up trying to trap me. He looked visibly annoyed whenever I was around, and I noticed that he even started torturing my classmates a bit less. So in the end, it was a win not just for me, but for the whole class. Edit. To clarify, I understand the importance of learning the basics and applying them correctly. A teacher's job is to make sure students grasp the fundamentals so they can handle more complex tasks later on. But Gargamel wasn't just teaching, he was actively trying to demoralize and inconvenience students, even when they were following his instructions. I'm sure many students performed worse than they would have without his constant toxic and offensive comments. It's worth noting that his students, on average, had poor grades, so it's not like his teaching methods were effective. He was known for being the teacher whose students often struggled, not just in our class, but across the board. Story 5. So, a little backstory. I work for an internet provider company as a lead in the internet repair department. This means I get calls from agents who either need help with a situation because they're stuck, or when a customer escalates the call asking for a supervisor, manager, or someone above them. My department mainly handles internet issues like being offline, outages, replacing equipment, and so on. The other day was like any other. I was getting calls from agents needing equipment transferred from one account to another, scheduling a technician for customers who refuse to do any troubleshooting. The list goes on. One of the most common calls I get is from agents asking me to run a special tool that corrects the speed being sent to a customer. This usually happens when a customer upgrades or downgrades their internet speed, and it doesn't take effect right away. This only takes a few minutes. This part comes into play later. On this particular day, I received a call from an agent saying her customer wanted to speak to a supervisor because he wasn't getting the speeds he was paying for. This happens quite often, usually because many people don't understand how the internet works and how various factors affect speed test results. These factors can include how far away you are from the router, whether you're testing on Wi-Fi or directly connected, how many devices are being used, and even things like how your home is built. Materials like stone or concrete can interfere with Wi-Fi signals. When I looked at the customer's account, I saw he was subscribed to 100 megabits per second. Our normal plans are 300, 500, and 1000 megabits per second, a gigabit. I asked the agent what speed he was getting, and she told me it was 437 megabits per second, which is way over what he was paying for. I told the agent to transfer him to me, and I'd continue the conversation. When the customer, whom we'll call Darren, got on the line, I introduced myself and asked how I could help. Darren immediately started yelling and cursing, saying he wasn't getting the speeds he paid for and demanding credit to his account. I tried to apologize and explain that speed tests can vary based on several factors, but he cut me off, stating that he was recording the call and would post everything I said on social media. I calmly told him that was fine since all our calls are recorded for quality assurance purposes, and everything would be documented. Darren continued cursing, saying this was unacceptable and that I should be ashamed for working for a company that doesn't provide what people pay for. As he ranted, I noticed that Darren had recently downgraded his internet plan from 500 megabits per second to 100 megabits per second just 2 days earlier. As I mentioned before, sometimes changes to internet speeds don't happen immediately, and we have to run a specific tool to correct it. This often happens when the modem hasn't been reset to reflect the changes. I tried to tell Darren that he was actually getting more than what he was paying for, but again, he cut me off, threatening to report us to the Federal Communications Commission, the Better Business Bureau, and file a lawsuit, all while still recording our conversation. Normally, I wouldn't mind and would let the higher speed continue until the system automatically corrected it. But Darren's rude behavior made me feel otherwise. Cue the malicious compliance. I responded, "Sir, you are absolutely right, and I'm so sorry you aren't receiving the speeds you're paying for. I'll get this fixed right away." Now, the 100 megabits per second plan Darren was on is a plan available only to customers who qualify for financial assistance due to low income. He had to apply for this program and be approved based on his financial situation. So, I ran the tool to correct his internet speed, bringing it down to 100 megabits per second as requested. I then asked him to check his speed again. Darren angrily responded, "It's even worse than before. What kind of trick are you trying to pull on me?" I calmly explained, "Sir, you told me you weren't getting the speeds you were paying for, and you were right. You recently applied for financial assistance, which downgraded your plan to 100 megabits per second, and I fixed it for you. It was wrong of us to be sending you 500 megabits per second when you were only paying for 100. I apologize for the inconvenience." After a few moments of silence, Darren muttered to himself, "This is ridiculous," and then disconnected the call. I made sure to leave detailed notes on his account so that any future agent would know what had happened and that he wasn't entitled to any credit on his bill. All I can say is, be careful what you complain about.